They say mother's intuition never lies, but what happens when everyone thinks you're just a paranoid old woman? What happens when the person destroying your life wears the mask of the perfect daughter-in-law? What happens when you realize that the fall that broke your arm wasn't an accident, but the beginning of someone's carefully planned endgame? My name is Susan Phillips, but everyone calls me Sue. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived through enough to know the difference between coincidence and conspiracy. For months, I watched my son's wife chip away at my life, piece by piece, smile by smile. She played her role so perfectly that even I questioned my own sanity. But when she pushed me down those stairs and shattered my arm, she made one critical mistake. She gave me time to think, time to plan, time to realize that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how my daughter-in-law tried to erase me from existence, and how her own impatience became her downfall. It's a story about family, betrayal, and the dangerous assumption that age equals weakness. But most importantly, it's about what happens when someone underestimates a woman who has nothing left to lose. When people ask me about my life before, everything changed. I tell them it was like living in a beautiful painting that someone kept touching up in all the wrong places. From the outside, our house on Maple Street looked like something out of a family magazine. White picket fence, rose bushes that bloomed precisely on schedule, and windows that always seemed to catch the light just right. Inside, my son David had built what everyone believed was the perfect family with his wife Jessica and their 8-year-old son Tommy. I suppose I should start by telling you about David. He's my only child, born when I was 28, and still believed the world was full of endless possibilities. His father, my late husband Robert, used to say David got my stubborn streak and his gentle heart. Robert passed away 4 years ago from a heart attack that came without warning, leaving me with a house too big for one person and a son who worried about me living alone. David works as an architect for a firm downtown, the kind of man who still opens doors for women and calls his mother every Sunday without fail. He's methodical, patient, and sees the good in everyone, qualities that made him an excellent father, and, unfortunately, an easy target for manipulation. When he met Jessica 3 years ago at a charity fundraiser, I watched him fall in love with the kind of intensity that makes you forget to breathe. Jessica Marlowe came into our lives like a summer storm, sudden, overwhelming, and impossible to ignore. She was 34, 12 years younger than David, with auburn hair that always seemed perfectly styled and green eyes that could shift from warm to calculating in the space of a heartbeat. She worked as a marketing executive for a luxury real estate company, the kind of woman who wore designer clothes to grocery stores and never seemed to have a hair out of place. From the very beginning, something felt off about Jessica, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what. It wasn't any one thing she said or did, but rather a collection of small moments that didn't quite add up. The way she studied our family, photos with too much interest, how she asked detailed questions about our family's financial situation under the guise of casual conversation, the manner in which she seemed to catalog every valuable item in our home during her first visit. But David was smitten, and when you love someone, you want to believe in their happiness. So when he announced they were getting married after only 8 months of dating, I swallowed my concerns and helped plan a wedding that cost more than most people's cars. Jessica insisted on having the reception at the country club, complete with imported flowers and a 7-course meal. She explained that first impressions mattered in her line of work, and she needed her wedding to reflect her professional success. The wedding day itself was beautiful. I'll give her that. Jessica looked stunning in a dress that cost more than my monthly pension, and David's face glowed with the kind of happiness I hadn't seen since he was a child on Christmas morning. During the father-daughter dance, David stepped in since Jessica's father had passed away years earlier. I noticed how she kept glancing around the room, as if she was performing for an audience rather than celebrating with family. After the honeymoon in Italy, They moved into David's house, and Jessica suggested I should move in with them. She presented it as concern for my well-being after Robert's death, pointing out how lonely I must be in our old house and how much help I could provide with Tommy when they had him on weekends. David thought it was a wonderful idea, and truthfully, the prospect of being closer to my family appealed to me. My house held too many memories, and the silence at night had become overwhelming. So I sold the house where I'd lived for 35 years, the place where David had taken his first steps and lost his first tooth, where Robert and I had shared countless quiet mornings over coffee and planned our retirement dreams. The sale brought in a substantial amount. The neighborhood had appreciated significantly over the years, and Robert's life insurance policy had been generous. Combined with my savings and his pension, I was financially comfortable, something Jessica seemed to note with particular interest. Moving into David and Jessica's house was supposed to be temporary, just until I found a suitable apartment or smaller home. But weeks turned into months, and whenever I brought up moving out, Jessica would insist I stay longer. She'd mention how much Tommy enjoyed having his grandmother around, or how helpful I was with household tasks, or how the housing market wasn't right for someone my age. Her arguments always sounded reasonable, caring even, and David would nod along, grateful that his wife was so thoughtful about his mother's well-being. Looking back now, I realized Jessica was never being kind. She was being strategic. The house had 5 bedrooms, so space wasn't an issue. They gave me the guest suite on the first floor, complete with a private bathroom and a small sitting area. It was comfortable, more luxurious than anywhere I'd ever lived, but it never felt like home. There was something sterile about the whole house, as if it had been decorated to impress rather than to live in comfortably. My daily routine became predictable quickly. I'd wake up early, usually around 6, and make coffee for myself and David before he left for work. Jessica rarely appeared before 9, claiming she was a night person and needed her beauty sleep. I'd spend my mornings reading, doing light housework, or tending to the small garden Jessica had allowed me to plant in the backyard. Afternoons were often spent running errands or preparing dinner, and evenings were family time when Tommy was with us. Tommy was the bright spot in everything. He's David's son from his first marriage to Linda, a sweet woman who died in a car accident when Tommy was 4. The boy had David's gentle nature, but also possessed a curious energy that reminded me of my son at that age. He'd spend hours with me in the garden, asking questions about plants and insects, or we'd work on puzzle books together at the kitchen table. It was during these quiet moments with Tommy that I first began to notice Jessica's true nature. When David was around, she was the picture of maternal devotion, helping with homework, planning educational outings, speaking to Tommy with patience and warmth. But when David left for work, her demeanor would shift subtly. She'd become distant, distracted, often sending Tommy to his room or to spend time with me so she could make long phone calls or disappear into her home office for hours. The first incident I can clearly remember happened about 6 months after I moved in. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch when Jessica came downstairs in workout clothes, her hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail despite having just woken up. She opened the refrigerator and stared at it for a long moment, before closing it with more force than necessary. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Sue," she said, her voice carrying a tone I hadn't heard before. "I thought we discussed keeping the refrigerator organized. I can't find anything in there." I looked up from the sandwich I was making for Tommy, confused. The refrigerator was perfectly organized. I'd spent 20 minutes that morning arranging everything by category and expiration date, just as Robert used to do. "I'm sorry, dear. What are you looking for? I'd be happy to help you find it." She opened the door again and gestured vaguely. "Everything is just everywhere. The milk should be on the top shelf, not the second. The vegetables need to be in the crisper drawers, not scattered around. It's basic organization, Sue. Her criticism stung, particularly because I knew the refrigerator was impeccably organized, but I apologized and offered to rearrange things, to her preference. She waved me off dismissively and grabbed a yogurt from the door, muttering something about how some people never learned proper household management. Over the following weeks, similar incidents began occurring with increasing frequency. Jessica would criticize how I folded laundry, claiming I was creating creases that would be difficult to iron out. She'd rearrange items I'd organized, insisting I'd put them in the wrong places. She'd make comments about my cooking being too salty or too bland, usually when David wasn't around to hear. Each criticism was delivered with a smile and a tone that could be interpreted as helpful rather than hurtful. If David happened to overhear, Jessica would quickly pivot to something positive, praising my efforts while subtly reinforcing her original complaint. "Sue works so hard in the kitchen," she'd say. "Even though the seasoning isn't quite right, I appreciate how much time she spends cooking for us." The psychological impact was subtle but constant. I began second-guessing myself, wondering if I really was becoming forgetful or incompetent. Had I always been this disorganized? Was my cooking actually declining with age? The self-doubt crept in slowly, like water seeping through a small crack in a foundation. But it wasn't just the criticism that bothered me. It was the way Jessica seemed to study me, as if she was cataloging my weaknesses and vulnerabilities. She'd ask seemingly innocent questions about my health, my medications, my daily routines. She'd inquire about my finances under the guise of helping me organize my paperwork or suggesting better investment strategies. "Sue, I hope you don't mind me asking," she said one afternoon while we were both in the living room. "But have you given any thought to what happens to your assets if something were to happen to you? I just worry that you don't have everything properly organized for David's sake." The question caught me off guard, both for its directness and for the assumption underlying it. "I have a will, dear, and everything is in order. David will inherit everything, of course, along with provisions for Tommy's education." She nodded thoughtfully, but I caught something in her expression, a flash of interest that seemed disproportionate to casual concern. "That's good to hear. And you've discussed this with David? Sometimes these family financial conversations can be awkward, but they're so important." I assured her that David and I had discussed my arrangements, though truthfully, we'd only talked about it in general terms. Robert had handled most of our financial planning, and after his death, I'd relied on our family attorney to ensure everything was properly structured. The conversation left me feeling unsettled, though I couldn't articulate why. The incidents escalated gradually. Jessica began accidentally bumping into me in hallways, creating situations where I'd stumble or lose my balance. She'd apologize profusely, expressing concern about my stability and suggesting I might need to consider using a walker for safety. When I'd protest that I was perfectly steady on my feet, she'd mention it to David as evidence of my denial about my declining physical condition. "I'm worried about your mother," I overheard her telling David one evening. "She nearly fell twice today, but she insists she doesn't need any help. I think her balance isn't what it used to be, but she's too proud to admit it." David would then approach me with gentle concern, asking if I'd been feeling dizzy or unsteady. His worry was genuine, which made Jessica's manipulation even more insidious. She was using his love for me as a weapon against both of us, creating problems she could then position herself to solve. The accidents became more frequent and more concerning. I'd find wet spots on floors where I was about to walk, despite having just seen Jessica mopping those exact areas. Cabinet doors would be left open at eye level, creating hazards I'd have to navigate around. Once, I discovered that the railing on the back porch steps had been loosened, though Jessica quickly suggested it must have been damaged by the recent storm and offered to have it repaired immediately. Each incident was plausibly deniable, explainable by coincidence or normal household wear and tear. But the pattern was becoming clear to me. even if I couldn't prove it to anyone else. Jessica was systematically creating dangerous situations, then positioning herself as my concerned caregiver when I pointed out the hazards. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more damaging than the physical dangers. Jessica had a talent for making comments that could be interpreted as either caring or cutting, depending on your perspective. She'd mention my senior moments, when I'd forget where I'd placed something, even though I'd later find the item moved from where I'd originally left it. She'd express concern about my confusion when I'd mention conversations or events that she'd claim never happened. "Sue, sweetie," she'd say with perfectly calibrated concern, "we didn't discuss changing the grocery shopping schedule. Are you sure you're remembering that correctly? Maybe you're thinking of something else." But I knew my memory was fine. I'd spent 72 years trusting my recollection, and while I occasionally forgot minor details like everyone does, I wasn't experiencing the kind of cognitive decline Jessica was suggesting. The gaslighting was subtle, but persistent, designed to make me question my own perceptions and experiences. The breaking point in our relationship came during a family barbecue in late spring. David had invited some colleagues and their families over for an afternoon gathering, and Jessica had spent days preparing for what she called an important networking opportunity. The house was spotless, the yard was perfectly manicured, and Jessica had hired a catering service to supplement the grilled food with elegant appetizers and desserts. I'd offered to help with preparations, but Jessica had politely declined, explaining that she had everything under control and preferred to handle hosting duties herself. On the day of the party, I made sure to stay out of her way, spending most of the afternoon in my room reading while she made final preparations. When guests began arriving, I joined the gathering in the backyard, wearing a nice dress I'd bought, specifically for the occasion. The party was lovely. David was in his element, discussing architecture projects with colleagues while their children played with Tommy in the yard. Jessica moved through the crowd like a seasoned hostess, ensuring everyone had drinks and food while sharing charming anecdotes about their life together. I was talking with one of David's coworkers, a nice woman named Carol, whose daughter was Tommy's age, when Jessica approached our small group. She joined the conversation seamlessly, but I noticed she kept glancing at my dress with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sue," she said during a natural lull in the conversation, "I love that dress on you. It's so vintage, very authentic." The comment was delivered with a smile, but I caught the subtle implication. Carol, perhaps sensing the awkwardness, complimented the dress genuinely, mentioning how classic styles never go out of fashion. But the seed had been planted. Jessica had managed to make me feel overdressed and out of place at what was supposed to be a family gathering. Later, as I was helping to clear dishes from the outdoor table, Jessica appeared beside me carrying a stack of plates. We were walking toward the kitchen together when she suddenly stumbled, apparently catching her foot on an uneven stone in the patio. The plates went flying, shattering against the ground in a spectacular crash that drew everyone's attention. "Oh my goodness!" Jessica exclaimed, immediately dropping to her knees to begin collecting broken pieces. "I'm so sorry, everyone. I must have tripped on something." David and several guests rushed over to help, expressing concern for Jessica and assuring her that accidents happen. But as I bent down to help clean up the mess, Jessica looked directly at me with an expression that was anything but accidental. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. "Sue," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "be careful with those sharp pieces. At our age, we need to be extra cautious about cuts and falls." The comment was designed to group us together as elderly women who needed special consideration, despite the fact that she was nearly 40 years younger than me. Several guests glanced at me with the kind of sympathetic concern usually reserved for frail, elderly people, and I realized Jessica had successfully repositioned me in their minds from David's competent mother to a fragile old woman who required careful handling. The remainder of the party passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Jessica's stumble had been deliberately orchestrated. The timing was too convenient, her recovery too quick, and her immediate focus on making me appear frail too calculated. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the evening's events, I began to understand that I wasn't dealing with simple dislike or personality conflict. Jessica was waging a campaign against me, using psychological manipulation and carefully staged incidents to undermine my credibility and independence. The question that kept me awake was why. What did she hope to gain by making me appear incompetent or unstable? The answer would become clear soon enough, but at the time, I was still trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. After all, what rational person would believe that their daughter-in-law was systematically trying to gaslight them? What loving son would accept that his wife was manipulating family dynamics for her own purposes? But as the weeks passed, the incidents continued to escalate. Small valuables began disappearing from my room: a gold bracelet Robert had given me for our anniversary, a silver letter opener that had belonged to my mother, a vintage fountain pen I'd inherited from my grandfather. When I'd mentioned the missing items to Jessica, she'd express concern about my misplacing things and suggest we should probably secure my more valuable possessions to prevent loss. "Maybe we should consider getting you a small safe for your room," she suggested after I mentioned the missing bracelet. "Sometimes older people forget where they put things, and it would give you peace of mind knowing your treasures are protected." Each suggestion was presented as caring support, but the underlying message was clear. I was becoming forgetful and irresponsible, incapable of managing my own belongings. When David heard about the missing items, Jessica was quick to frame the conversation around my increasing confusion rather than potential theft. "I'm worried about Mom," she told David one evening, not realizing I could hear them from the kitchen. "She's been misplacing things more frequently, and today she couldn't remember where she'd put her medication. I found the bottle in the refrigerator, of all places." This was a complete fabrication. I kept my medications in a clearly labeled organizer in my bathroom, and I'd never misplaced a dose. But Jessica's lie was so specific and delivered with such apparent concern that David immediately accepted it as truth. The medication incident was particularly troubling because it suggested Jessica was entering my private space and manipulating my belongings. The thought of her going through my things, moving items around to create evidence of my supposed confusion, made me feel violated and vulnerable in what was supposed to be my safe haven. That's when I began to realize Jessica wasn't just trying to make me uncomfortable enough to move out. She was building a case for something much more serious. Every accident, every instance of confusion, every misplaced item was being carefully documented and reported to David as evidence of my declining mental and physical capacity. The full scope of her plan became clear on a Tuesday afternoon in early summer. I was in the garden, watering the tomatoes I'd planted against the back fence, when I heard Jessica on the phone in her office. The window was open, and her voice carried clearly across the yard. "No, she's not there yet," Jessica was saying to someone, "but she's getting close. The doctor visit next week should provide the documentation we need. A few more incidents, maybe another fall, and we'll have grounds for a competency evaluation." My blood ran cold as I realized what I was hearing. Jessica was discussing me with someone, a lawyer perhaps, or a healthcare professional, and they were planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. The doctor visit she'd mentioned was an appointment she'd scheduled for me with a geriatrician, claiming David was concerned about my recent forgetfulness and wanted me to have a comprehensive health assessment. "The timing has to be right," Jessica continued. "If we move too fast, David might get suspicious. But if we wait too long, she might catch on and make things difficult." I stood frozen among my tomato plants, the garden hose still running in my hand, as the full magnitude of Jessica's plan revealed itself. She wasn't just trying to make me appear incompetent. She was orchestrating a systematic campaign to have me declared legally incapable of managing my own affairs. Once that happened, David would likely become my guardian. But as his wife, Jessica would have significant influence over decisions regarding my care and, more importantly, my finances. Everything fell into place with sickening clarity. The constant criticism designed to undermine my confidence. The staged accidents meant to make me appear physically unstable. The missing items that could be attributed to dementia or confusion. The gaslighting intended to make me question my own memory and perception. Jessica had been building a comprehensive case for my incompetency, using my own son's love and concern as tools in her manipulation. But why? What did she stand to gain from having control over an elderly woman's assets? The answer came to me. As I remembered her questions about my will, her interest in our family's financial situation, her careful cataloging of valuable items in the house. Jessica had married David not just for love, but for access to our family's accumulated wealth. With Robert's life insurance, the proceeds from our house sale, and my various savings and investments, I represented a significant financial asset. If Jessica could have me declared incompetent, she would gain control over my finances through David. As my primary caregiver and David's wife, she could make decisions about my living arrangements, my medical care, and my spending. She could move me into a care facility, sell my remaining possessions, and gradually drain my accounts under the guise of paying for my care. The realization was devastating, not just because of Jessica's betrayal, but because of what it meant for David. My son, who'd opened his home to me out of love and concern, was being manipulated by his wife into becoming an unwitting accomplice in her scheme. His genuine worry about my well-being was being weaponized against both of us. Standing in that garden, holding a dripping hose while Jessica planned my destruction 20 feet away, I faced a choice that would define everything that came next. I could confront her directly, but she'd already proven herself adept at twisting conversations and manipulating situations to her advantage. I could tell David, but he was so thoroughly convinced of Jessica's devotion that he'd likely dismiss my concerns as paranoid delusions, exactly what Jessica had been priming him to expect. Or I could do something that might surprise everyone, including myself. I could stop being the victim and start being the strategist. As I turned off the hose and walked slowly back toward the house, Jessica's voice continuing to drift from her office window, I began to understand that this was war. She'd been fighting it for months, using weapons I hadn't even recognized until now. But warfare was something I understood better than she realized. I'd lived through the Cold War, raised a child during the Vietnam conflict, and navigated decades of corporate politics when women were expected to smile and stay quiet. I'd buried a husband, survived cancer, and rebuilt my life more times than I could count. Jessica might have youth and beauty on her side, but I had something she'd clearly underestimated: experience, patience, and absolutely nothing left to lose. The next phase of this battle would be different, because now I knew the rules of engagement. Jessica wanted to play games with people's perceptions and trust? Fine. But she was about to learn something that would serve her well in prison. Never underestimate a woman who's spent 7 decades learning how to survive in a world that constantly tries to dismiss her. The garden hose was neatly coiled by the time Jessica finished her call, and I was sitting peacefully in my chair by the window, working on a crossword puzzle as if I hadn't heard a thing. When she emerged from her office a few minutes later, I smiled pleasantly and asked if she'd like some iced tea. "That would be lovely, Sue," she replied with her practiced warmth. "You're always so thoughtful." As I prepared the tea, adding exactly the right amount of sugar and lemon, just the way she liked it, I reflected on how much everything had changed in the span of a single overheard conversation. Jessica thought she was closing in on victory, carefully positioning the pieces for her final move. But she'd made one critical error in her strategy. She'd assumed that her opponent was a confused, helpless old woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded. What she'd failed to realize was that I was actually a sharp, experienced strategist who'd just been given perfect intelligence about her enemy's plans. The real game was about to begin, and this time, I intended to win. The morning after I overheard Jessica's phone conversation, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. For the first time since moving into this house, I understood exactly what I was dealing with, and more importantly, I had a plan. The woman who had been systematically dismantling my life thought she was close to victory, but she had no idea that her intended victim had just transformed into her most dangerous opponent. I lay in bed for an extra hour that morning, not from fatigue or depression as Jessica might assume if she noticed, but because I was mentally preparing for what would be the most important performance of my life. Every interaction from this point forward would need to be carefully calculated. Every word, every gesture, every reaction would serve a purpose in my counter-strategy. The first thing I needed to do was establish a baseline of documentation. If Jessica was building a case against my competency, I needed to build an even stronger case against her credibility. But unlike her campaign of subtle manipulation and staged incidents, my evidence would be concrete, irrefutable, and devastating. I started with a journal, though not the kind Jessica might expect an elderly woman to keep. Instead of recording my daily activities or emotional reflections, I began documenting every interaction, every suspicious incident, every lie I could prove. I wrote in a composition notebook I'd purchased months earlier for Tommy's school project, hiding it inside the dust jacket of a romance novel I kept on my nightstand. Jessica would never think to look inside a book she'd probably dismiss as mindless entertainment. The entries were precise and factual, written in the clear, analytical style I'd developed during my years working as a legal secretary before David was born. Each incident was dated, timed, and described with the kind of detail that would hold up under scrutiny. I included direct quotes whenever possible, noting the presence or absence of witnesses, and cross-referenced events with external markers like television programs or meals to establish accurate timelines. More importantly, I began setting traps. The first test came that very morning at breakfast. Jessica appeared in the kitchen at her usual 9 o'clock, looking perfectly put together despite having allegedly just woken up. Her hair was styled, her makeup was flawless, and she wore a silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries. She greeted me with her customary warmth, asking how I'd slept and whether I needed anything for the day. "Actually, dear," I said, stirring my coffee with deliberate casualness, "I was wondering if you could help me find my reading glasses. I seem to have misplaced them again." This was a lie. My reading glasses were safely tucked in the book I'd been using to hide my journal. But I wanted to see how Jessica would respond to an opportunity to reinforce her narrative about my increasing forgetfulness. "Oh, Sue," she said with perfectly calibrated concern. "You've been misplacing things so often lately. Where did you last remember having them?" "I thought I left them on the kitchen counter last night, but they're not there now." I made my voice sound slightly confused, even a little frustrated with myself. Jessica's eyes lit up with what I now recognized as predatory satisfaction. "Let me help you look." Sometimes, when we're tired, we put things in unusual places without realizing it. We spent 15 minutes searching the kitchen, with Jessica making increasingly pointed comments about how concerning my forgetfulness was becoming. She suggested I might need to develop better organizational habits, perhaps keep a notebook to track where I put important items. The irony of her suggesting a notebook was almost too perfect. "Found them," I exclaimed, pulling the glasses from the pocket of my robe. How silly of me. I must have put them there last night without thinking. Jessica's expression flickered with annoyance at being denied the opportunity to discover them in some embarrassing location, but she quickly recovered. "That's such a relief. But Sue, this is exactly what I was talking to David about. These little episodes are becoming more frequent." "Episodes?" I repeated, making my voice sound uncertain. "Well, misplacing things, forgetting conversations, getting confused about schedules. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It happens to everyone as they get older. But David and I think it might be time to talk to a doctor about strategies to help you stay organized and safe. There it was. The setup for the medical appointment she'd already scheduled without my knowledge, presented as a caring suggestion rather than a predetermined plan. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her advice for the first time. You might be right, dear. I certainly don't want to be a burden on you and David. You're never a burden, Sue. We're family, and family takes care of each other. The sincerity in her voice was so convincing that if I hadn't overheard her phone call, I might have believed her genuine concern. Instead, I recognized it as the performance of a skilled manipulator who'd had years to perfect her craft. That afternoon, while Jessica was at work and David was at the office, I began phase 2 of my investigation. Using skills I'd developed during my years as a legal secretary, I started researching Jessica's background with the kind of thoroughness she'd never expect from a supposedly confused elderly woman. The internet was a revelation. At 72, I was part of the last generation to adapt to digital technology as adults, but I'd embraced it with the same determination I'd applied to every other challenge in my life. Robert and I had purchased our first computer when David was in college, recognizing that the world was changing and we needed to change with it. What I discovered about Jessica Marlowe was both fascinating and deeply troubling. Her LinkedIn profile presented a polished professional image, marketing executive with an impressive list of accomplishments and a network of influential contacts. But deeper searches revealed inconsistencies that made me question everything she'd told us about her background. The luxury real estate company she claimed to work for had no record of a Jessica Marlowe in their employee directory, though they did list a Jennifer Marlowe in their marketing department. The timeline of her career achievements didn't align with her stated age, suggesting she'd either inflated her experience or lied about when she'd graduated from college. More concerning were the gaps in her digital footprint. For someone who supposedly worked in marketing, Jessica had remarkably little online presence prior to 3 years ago. No social media history, no professional associations, no mention in industry publications or company newsletters. It was as if she'd materialized fully formed just around the time she'd met David. I spent hours that afternoon cross-referencing names, dates, and locations, building a timeline of Jessica's life that was full of holes and contradictions. The woman who'd married my son and was now living in our house was not who she claimed to be, and I was beginning to suspect she'd done this before. The breakthrough came when I searched for variations of her name combined with terms like fraud, elder abuse, and marriage scam. What I found made my blood run cold. Jennifer Marlowe, age 34, had been arrested 2 years earlier in another state for financial exploitation of an elderly person. The charges had been dropped when the victim died before the case went to trial, but the details in the police report were chillingly familiar. Jennifer had married into a family with elderly relatives, gained their trust through careful manipulation, then systematically stolen from them while working to have them declared incompetent. The victim in that case had been an 80-year-old man, whose stepson had married Jennifer after a whirlwind courtship. Within months of the marriage, the elderly man had begun experiencing a series of accidents and health incidents that left him increasingly dependent on Jennifer's care. When family members became suspicious, Jennifer had convinced her husband that his stepfather was developing dementia and needed professional care. The elderly man had died in a care facility 6 months later, apparently from complications related to a fall down a flight of stairs. By then, Jennifer had gained control of his finances and had transferred significant assets to accounts she controlled. The investigation had begun when distant relatives questioned the rapid depletion of his estate, but Jennifer had disappeared before authorities could build a solid case. The photograph accompanying the police report showed a woman with dark hair and different features, but plastic surgery could explain the physical changes. More telling were the details of her method, the same pattern of staged accidents, gaslighting, and systematic isolation I was experiencing. Jessica Marlowe was Jennifer Marlowe, and I was not her first victim. I was simply her latest target in what appeared to be a well-practiced pattern of predatory behavior. Armed with this information, I faced a critical decision. I could take what I'd learned to the police immediately, but without concrete evidence of wrongdoing in our specific situation, they might dismiss my concerns as the paranoid delusions of an elderly woman, exactly what Jessica had been conditioning people to expect. I could confront David with my discoveries, but his emotional investment in his marriage would make him resistant to believing such devastating accusations against his wife. Or I could continue playing Jessica's game while building an unassailable case against her, using her own tactics against her while documenting everything for authorities. The risk was enormous. If she realized I'd discovered her true identity, she might accelerate her timeline and put me in immediate physical danger. But the potential reward was complete victory, not just for me but for her future victims who would be spared her predatory behavior. I chose to continue the game, but with rules she didn't know we were playing. That evening, I made a show of struggling with simple tasks. I asked Jessica to help me figure out how to use the television remote, claiming I couldn't remember which buttons to press. I mentioned being confused about what day it was, wondering aloud if I'd taken my medication that morning. I even staged a minor stumble while walking through the living room, catching myself on the arm of the sofa while making a comment about my balance not being what it used to be. Jessica responded to each incident with the perfect blend of concern and patronizing sympathy I'd come to expect. She helped with the remote while suggesting that electronics were becoming too complicated for people of our generation. She offered to help organize my medication into a daily pill dispenser so I wouldn't have to worry about remembering doses. She expressed concern about my stumble and suggested we might need to consider removing some of the area rugs that could pose tripping hazards. But underneath her caring facade, I could see the satisfaction she took in my apparent decline. Each demonstration of confusion or physical instability was validation of her strategy, proof that her campaign was working. She was documenting everything, either mentally or through notes she thought I couldn't see, building her case for the competency evaluation she'd discussed during that phone call. What she didn't realize was that I was documenting her documentation, recording not just her responses to my staged incidents, but also her methods of gathering and presenting evidence. I was learning how she built her cases against victims, information that would be crucial when authorities eventually examined her pattern of behavior. The next morning brought a new development that would test both our strategies. David announced at breakfast that he'd scheduled a long weekend getaway for himself and Jessica, a romantic trip to a resort in the mountains to celebrate their third wedding anniversary. They'd be leaving Friday afternoon and returning Monday evening, 4 days during which I'd be alone in the house with Tommy. "I feel terrible leaving you, Mom," David said, his genuine concern evident in his voice. "But Jessica has been working so hard lately, and I thought she deserved a break." "Don't be silly, dear," I replied, though my mind was already racing through the implications. "Tommy and I will be perfectly fine. We'll have our own little adventure while you're gone." Jessica smiled and nodded, but I caught something calculating in her expression. The timing seemed almost too convenient, just days after I'd overheard her discussing the need for a few more incidents to build her case. A weekend alone with Tommy would give her the perfect opportunity to stage something more serious than the minor accidents she'd been arranging. But it would also give me an opportunity I hadn't expected. 4 days without Jessica's constant surveillance would allow me to conduct a thorough search of her personal spaces, looking for evidence of her true identity and her plans for me. More importantly, it would give me time to contact the authorities, in the state where Jennifer Marlowe had been arrested, gathering information that could be crucial to stopping her current scheme. The week leading up to their departure was filled with Jessica's increasingly obvious attempts to establish my incompetence. She arranged for me to accompany her to the grocery store, then made pointed comments about my confusion when I couldn't find items in the unfamiliar layout. She invited me to help with dinner preparation, then criticized my knife skills and suggested that perhaps I shouldn't be handling sharp objects without supervision. Each incident was carefully witnessed by David or Tommy, ensuring that others would remember my apparent struggles. Jessica was building a comprehensive narrative of decline that would support whatever incident she was planning for the weekend. But I had surprises of my own in store. On Wednesday evening, I made a call to my old friend Margaret, a retired nurse who'd worked with me on several community volunteer projects over the years. Margaret had always been sharp, observant, and completely trustworthy. Exactly the kind of witness I needed for what I was planning. "Margaret, dear, I hope I'm not calling too late," I said when she answered. "I was wondering if you might be available to spend the weekend with me. David and Jessica are going away, and I'd appreciate the company." Margaret was delighted to accept, especially when I mentioned that Tommy would be there and we could spoil him properly. What I didn't tell her was that her presence would serve as protection against whatever Jessica might be planning, while also providing an intelligent witness to document Jessica's behavior upon their return. When I mentioned Margaret's visit to Jessica the next morning, her reaction was swift and telling. For just a moment, her mask slipped completely, and I saw pure fury in her eyes before she recovered her composure. "That's wonderful that Margaret can visit," she said, though her smile was strained. "I just hope having company won't be too tiring for you. You've been having such a difficult time lately with confusion and fatigue." "Actually, I've been feeling much better," I replied cheerfully. "Maybe I was just going through a rough patch. These things happen at my age." Jessica's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. My sudden improvement didn't fit her narrative of steady decline, and the presence of an outside witness would complicate whatever she'd been planning for the weekend. "Well, if you're sure you're up for entertaining guests," she said finally. "I just worry about you overexerting yourself." That afternoon, Jessica made an excuse to run errands alone, something she rarely did during the day. I suspected she was making phone calls she didn't want overheard, possibly adjusting plans that no longer included an isolated, vulnerable target. Margaret arrived Friday afternoon just as David and Jessica were loading their car for the mountain resort. She was the same sharp, energetic woman I remembered, with silver hair neatly styled and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her nursing background had given her excellent observational skills, and she'd always been protective of people she cared about. "Sue looks wonderful," Margaret announced loudly enough for Jessica to hear. "I was worried when you said she'd been having some health issues, but she seems as sharp as ever." Jessica's goodbye was cooler than usual, though she maintained her facade of caring concern. "Please call if there are any problems," she told Margaret. "Sue has been having some episodes lately. Confusion, balance issues, that sort of thing. We're hoping it's just temporary, but you never know at our age." "I'll keep an eye on things," Margaret assured her, though I caught the skeptical look she shot in my direction. Margaret had known me for 15 years, and she recognized that whatever Jessica was describing didn't match the woman standing in front of her. As soon as David and Jessica's car disappeared down the street, Margaret turned to me with the direct manner I'd always appreciated about her. "All right, Sue, what's really going on here? That woman was describing symptoms of dementia, but you're clearly functioning at full capacity. And why did you really invite me for this weekend?" I led Margaret into the living room, where Tommy was absorbed in a video game, and told her everything. I showed her my hidden journal, shared the evidence I'd gathered about Jessica's true identity, and explained the pattern of manipulation and staged incidents I'd been experiencing. Margaret listened with the professional attention she'd once given to patient reports, asking clarifying questions and taking notes of her own. When I finished, she sat back with a grim expression. "That's one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes I've ever heard of," she said. "The psychological manipulation alone is incredibly damaging, but the long-term planning suggests she's done this before." "She has," I said, and shared what I'd discovered about Jennifer Marlowe's previous victim. Margaret's face hardened with the kind of protective anger I'd seen in nurses who discovered patients were being mistreated. "We need to stop her, Sue. Not just for you, but for whoever she targets next." "I'm planning to, but I need more evidence. Jessica's been careful to make everything look like accidents or normal aging issues. I need to catch her in something undeniable." "What do you have in mind?" Over the next hour, I outlined my strategy for the weekend. Margaret's presence had already disrupted whatever Jessica might have planned, but I intended to use the time more productively. With Margaret as my witness and ally, I could conduct a thorough search of Jessica's personal spaces, document everything I found, and begin building the kind of evidence that would convince authorities to take action. Saturday morning, while Tommy was at soccer practice with one of David's neighbors, Margaret and I began our investigation. Jessica's home office was locked, but I'd noticed she kept a spare key in a decorative box on her dresser. The office was immaculate, organized with the precision I'd come to associate with Jessica's public persona. Her computer was password protected, but her filing system was revealing. She kept meticulous records of financial information, including copies of bank statements, investment summaries, and insurance policies that I didn't remember giving her access to. More troubling were the medical records. Not just mine, but detailed notes about my daily activities, my comments and behaviors, and her assessments of my mental state. "Look at this," Margaret said, holding up a folder labeled Competency Documentation. Inside were photographs of the missing items from my room, time-stamped and labeled as evidence of memory loss and disorganization. There were also photos of me during various activities, taken without my knowledge and annotated with comments about my apparent confusion or physical instability. But the most damning evidence was a legal document I found in her desk drawer. A power of attorney form, with my forged signature, already notarized and ready to be filed. Jessica had been preparing to take control of my finances without my knowledge or consent, using the competency evaluation as a cover for what amounted to legal theft. "This is fraud," Margaret said, photographing the document with her phone. "This signature doesn't even look like yours." We spent the rest of the morning documenting everything, taking photos of her records, her notes, and the evidence she'd been gathering to use against me. By afternoon, we had enough material to support criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. But the most shocking discovery came when we searched Jessica's bedroom. Hidden in a box at the back of her closet, underneath winter clothes that smelled of expensive perfume, we found a collection of identification documents in different names. Driver's licenses, social security cards, and credit cards for Jennifer Marlowe, Janet Morrison, and Jessica Manning, all with the same photograph but different personal information. "She's been doing this for years," Margaret said, studying the documents. "These aren't just aliases, they're complete identities." There were also personal items that clearly belonged to previous victims: jewelry, watches, and family photographs that Jessica had obviously taken as souvenirs of her successful schemes. Among them was a locket containing the photograph of an elderly man I didn't recognize, but whose face bore the kind of gentle expression that reminded me of my late husband. The evidence was overwhelming, but I knew Jessica would return Sunday evening expecting to find a confused, isolated elderly woman who could be easily manipulated into signing documents or agreeing to medical evaluations. Instead, she would find two sharp, determined women who had documented her crimes and were prepared to end her predatory career. Sunday afternoon, Margaret and I made calls to law enforcement in multiple states, reporting what we'd discovered and requesting investigations into Jessica's activities. We also contacted Adult Protective Services, providing them with copies of our evidence and requesting immediate intervention. The detective who took our call in the state where Jennifer Marlowe had been arrested was particularly interested in our findings. "We always suspected she was involved in other cases," he said. "But victims of these schemes often don't report them, and when they do, the evidence is usually circumstantial. What you've gathered could be the key to stopping her permanently." By Sunday evening, we had law enforcement and social services personnel ready to act, but they wanted to wait until Jessica returned and could be confronted with the evidence. The plan was to let her incriminate herself further by attempting to follow through with her scheme, while ensuring my safety through constant surveillance. When David and Jessica returned from their weekend getaway that evening, they found Margaret and me in the living room, playing cards with Tommy and sharing stories from our younger days. Jessica's expression was carefully controlled, but I could see the tension in her shoulders as she realized her plans for the weekend had been completely disrupted. "Did you ladies have a nice time?" she asked, her voice carrying that familiar note of patronizing concern. "Wonderful," Margaret replied cheerfully. Sue was a perfect hostess, sharp as ever, organized, completely on top of everything. "I can't imagine where you got the idea that she was having cognitive issues." Jessica's smile became strained. "Well, she has her good days and bad days. Sometimes the symptoms are more subtle than obvious." "Interesting," Margaret said, her nursing background evident in the way she studied Jessica's reactions. "In my experience, cognitive decline follows pretty predictable patterns. What Sue described sounded more like temporary stress or adjustment issues than actual dementia." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Margaret systematically dismantling Jessica's narrative about my mental state, while Jessica struggled to maintain her caring facade. I watched the interaction with fascination, recognizing that Margaret was conducting her own form of psychological warfare, using professional knowledge and direct observation to undermine Jessica's carefully constructed lies. David, meanwhile, seemed confused by the conflicting reports about my condition. His mother appeared perfectly normal, engaged and alert, while his wife insisted I'd been experiencing significant cognitive decline. The contradiction was creating doubt in his mind, exactly what Margaret and I had hoped to achieve. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I lay awake knowing that the final confrontation was approaching. Jessica would soon realize that her weekend plans had been disrupted by more than just Margaret's unexpected visit. The evidence we'd gathered would expose not just her current scheme, but her entire pattern of predatory behavior. Tomorrow would bring the reckoning she'd been working toward for months, but not the one she'd planned. Instead of a confused, helpless victim ready to be institutionalized and robbed, she would face a sharp, prepared adversary backed by law enforcement and armed with irrefutable evidence of her crimes. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, and Jessica's carefully orchestrated plan was about to collapse around her. But she didn't know that yet. For now, she was still operating under the assumption that she was dealing with a vulnerable elderly woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded. She was about to learn how wrong she'd been about everything. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability hanging in the air. I woke before dawn, not from anxiety, but from the sharp focus that comes when you know you're approaching a decisive moment. Margaret was already awake when I padded to the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the determined expression I remembered from her nursing days when she was preparing for a difficult shift. "Sleep well?" she asked, though we both knew the answer. "As well as someone can when they're about to expose a predator," I replied, pouring my own coffee. "Are you ready for this?" Margaret nodded firmly. "I've dealt with my share of people who prey on the vulnerable. It never gets easier, but it never gets less necessary either." The morning routine proceeded normally on the surface. David left for work with his usual kiss goodbye and reminder to call if I needed anything. Tommy caught the school bus with his backpack and lunchbox, blissfully unaware that his home was about to become the center of a criminal investigation. Jessica emerged from her room at precisely 9 o'clock, looking as polished and composed as ever, though I noticed a tension around her eyes that hadn't been there before Margaret's arrival. "How are you feeling today, Sue?" Jessica asked with her practiced concern. "I hope having company over the weekend wasn't too exhausting." "Actually, I feel better than I have in months," I replied truthfully. Margaret thinks the fresh perspective did me good. She suggested that maybe I've just been going through a rough adjustment period rather than experiencing any real cognitive decline. Jessica's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Well, Margaret means well, but she's not a medical professional who specializes in geriatric care. Sometimes friends want to be encouraging even when there are real concerns. Oh, but Margaret is a medical professional, I said innocently. She was head nurse at the memory care unit at St. Mary's for 12 years before she retired. She's very experienced with cognitive assessment and elder care. The color drained slightly from Jessica's face. She'd built her strategy around the assumption that I was isolated from knowledgeable advocates who could challenge her narrative. The presence of a retired nurse with specialized experience in exactly the area Jessica was targeting represented a significant threat to her plans. I see, Jessica said carefully. Well, professional opinions can vary. What matters is getting you the right kind of evaluation and care. Margaret chose that moment to enter the kitchen, carrying the morning newspaper and radiating the confident competence that had made her such an effective nurse. Good morning, Jessica. Sue and I were just discussing her health. I have to say, after spending several days with her, I don't see any evidence of the cognitive issues you mentioned. Her memory is excellent, her reasoning is sharp, and her physical coordination is perfectly normal for someone her age. Jessica's composure was beginning to crack around the edges. Like I said, she has good days and bad days. You might not have seen her during one of her episodes. In my experience, Margaret replied with professional authority, cognitive decline doesn't work that way. Dementia symptoms are consistent and progressive, not intermittent. What you're describing sounds more like the effects of stress, medication, interactions, or even deliberate manipulation of someone's environment to create confusion. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Jessica's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating before she recovered her concerned daughter-in-law persona. I think you might be misunderstanding the situation, Jessica said, her voice carrying a subtle edge. I live with Sue every day. I see things that occasional visitors might miss. I'm sure you do, Margaret replied meaningfully. The question is whether what you're seeing is natural decline or something else entirely. I watched this exchange with fascination, recognizing that Margaret was conducting a subtle interrogation designed to put Jessica on the defensive. Every response Jessica made was being evaluated not just for content, but for the psychological patterns that revealed her true motivations. After breakfast, Jessica retreated to her office, claiming she needed to catch up on work emails. But I suspected she was making phone calls related to the medical appointment she'd scheduled for me, possibly trying to accelerate her timeline, in response to the unexpected complications Margaret's presence had created. Margaret and I spent the morning in my room, ostensibly organizing my belongings, but actually finalizing our preparations for the confrontation we knew was coming. The evidence we'd gathered was now safely copied and distributed to multiple law enforcement agencies, but we needed to be careful about how we proceeded. Jessica was clearly becoming suspicious, and cornered predators could be dangerous. The detective I spoke with yesterday wants us to try to get her to incriminate herself on tape, Margaret told me quietly. They're particularly interested in getting her to admit to the forged power of attorney or to make threats about what will happen if you don't cooperate with her plans. I nodded, understanding the strategy. Criminal cases were stronger when defendants convicted themselves through their own words and actions, but I also understood the risk involved in provoking someone who had already demonstrated a willingness to cause physical harm. There's something else, Margaret continued, her voice even lower. The detective ran a more comprehensive background check on Jennifer Marlowe after our call yesterday. They found 2 other cases in different states, where elderly people died under suspicious circumstances shortly after she entered their families. No charges were filed because the deaths appeared to be accidental, but the pattern is unmistakable. The implication was chilling. Jessica wasn't just a financial predator. She was potentially responsible for multiple deaths. The stakes of our confrontation had just become much higher than I'd realized. "We need to be very careful about this," I said. "If she's killed before, she won't hesitate to eliminate threats to her current operation." "The police are aware of the danger," Margaret assured me. "They're planning to have undercover officers nearby when we make our move, but we need to get her to reveal herself before they can intervene." The opportunity came sooner than expected. Around noon, Jessica emerged from her office with an expression of forced cheerfulness that didn't reach her eyes. "Sue, I have wonderful news," she announced. "I was able to move up your appointment with Dr. Morrison. He had a cancellation this afternoon, and I thought it would be better to get your evaluation done sooner rather than later." Dr. Morrison was the geriatrician Jessica had originally scheduled me to see the following week, supposedly at David's request, but actually as part of her plan to have me declared incompetent. Moving up the timeline suggested she was feeling pressured to accelerate her scheme. "That's very considerate of you, dear," I replied. "But I'm feeling so much better today that I'm not sure the appointment is necessary. Margaret thinks I might have just been going through a temporary adjustment. Period." Jessica's smile became strained. "Sue, we've discussed this. These kinds of issues need professional evaluation, not amateur diagnosis. Dr. Morrison is expecting us at 2:00. "Actually," Margaret interjected, "as Sue's friend and someone with medical experience, I'd like to accompany her to this appointment. It's always helpful to have an advocate present during medical evaluations, especially when there are concerns about cognitive function." For a moment, Jessica's mask slipped completely, revealing pure fury before she regained control. The last thing she wanted was a knowledgeable witness present when she tried to manipulate a medical professional into supporting her narrative. "I don't think that's necessary," Jessica said tightly. "Family members are perfectly capable of advocating for Sue's interests." "Of course they are," Margaret agreed pleasantly. "But additional perspective never hurts, especially from someone with professional training. I'm sure Dr. Morrison would welcome input from someone familiar with geriatric assessment." The tension in the room was palpable. Jessica was trapped between her need to proceed with the medical evaluation and her inability to control the narrative with Margaret present. Any objection she made to Margaret's attendance would reveal her true motives, but allowing an experienced nurse to observe the evaluation would undermine her ability to manipulate the outcome. "Fine," Jessica said finally, her voice carefully controlled. "If you think it's necessary, Margaret can come along. Though I should warn Dr. Morrison that Sue has been having some good days and bad days lately. He needs to understand that her current alertness might not be representative of her overall condition." It was exactly the kind of statement we needed her to make on record. Margaret was wearing a small recording device provided by the detective we'd spoken with, and Jessica's words would serve as evidence of her intent to deceive medical professionals about my condition. The afternoon appointment became a carefully orchestrated performance with multiple audiences. Dr. Morrison was a distinguished man in his 60s, with the kind of thorough, patient manner that inspired confidence. Jessica had clearly briefed him in advance about my supposed symptoms, because he began the session with questions designed to assess cognitive function. But Margaret's presence changed the entire dynamic of the evaluation. When Dr. Morrison asked about my memory, Margaret was able to provide specific examples of my sharp recollection from our weekend together. When he inquired about my physical stability, she described my steady gait and excellent coordination during our activities. Most importantly, when Jessica tried to interject with examples of my supposed confusion, Margaret politely but firmly corrected the record with her own observations. "Mrs. Phillips," Dr. Morrison said after completing his examination, "I have to say that I'm not seeing evidence of the cognitive decline that was described to me over the phone. Your memory appears excellent, your reasoning is clear, and your physical examination is completely normal for someone your age." Jessica's composure finally cracked. Doctor, with respect, I live with Sue every day. I see her confusion, her memory lapses, her physical instability. These symptoms are real, even if they're not apparent during a single office visit. I understand your concern, Dr. Morrison replied diplomatically. But clinical assessment requires objective evidence, not subjective reports. Mrs. Phillips shows no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair her decision-making capacity. But she's been having episodes, Jessica insisted, her voice rising slightly. She forgets conversations, misplaces important items, gets confused about simple tasks. Surely that indicates some level of cognitive impairment. Margaret leaned forward with her professional manner. Doctor, in my experience as a geriatric nurse, the symptoms Mrs. Marlowe is describing could have many explanations. Medication interactions, stress, environmental factors, or even deliberate manipulation of someone's living situation can create apparent confusion in elderly individuals. The implication was clear, and Dr. Morrison's expression sharpened with understanding. He'd undoubtedly encountered cases of elder abuse disguised as medical concerns, and Margaret's professional perspective was providing him with a different framework for understanding the situation. Mrs. Marlowe, Dr. Morrison said carefully, I think it might be helpful if we discussed Mrs. Phillips's living situation and daily routine in more detail. Sometimes apparent cognitive symptoms can be related to environmental stressors rather than underlying medical conditions. Jessica realized she was losing control of the narrative. Her carefully planned medical evaluation was backfiring, creating doubt about her credibility rather than supporting her claims about my incompetence. Worse, she was facing questions about her own behavior and motivations. I think we're overthinking this, Jessica said, standing abruptly. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up appointment when Sue is having one of her more difficult days. But Dr. Morrison wasn't finished. Actually, Mrs. Marlowe, I'd like to document today's findings thoroughly. Mrs. Phillips, do you have any concerns about your living situation or your ability to manage your own affairs? This was the moment I'd been preparing for. Doctor, I've been feeling much more confident about my mental abilities since Margaret's visit. She's helped me realize that some of the confusion I've been experiencing might not be related to aging at all. What do you mean by that? Dr. Morrison asked. Well, I've noticed that my supposed memory problems often involve items that have been moved from where I left them, or conversations that allegedly took place when no one else was present to confirm them. Margaret has helped me understand that environmental manipulation can create symptoms that mimic cognitive decline. Jessica's face was flushed with anger and barely controlled panic. Sue, you're confusing yourself again. No one has been moving your things or manipulating anything. These kinds of paranoid thoughts are actually another symptom of cognitive decline. Are they? Margaret asked pointedly. Because in my professional experience, elderly people who report environmental manipulation are often telling the truth. Elder abuse frequently includes gaslighting and deliberate creation of confusion to make victims appear incompetent. Dr. Morrison was now looking at Jessica with obvious suspicion. The consultation had shifted from an evaluation of my mental capacity to an examination of the dynamics in our household, and Jessica was clearly failing the assessment. Mrs. Phillips, Dr. Morrison said, do you feel safe in your current living situation? Do you have any concerns about how you're being treated by family members? It was the opening I needed. Doctor, I've become increasingly concerned about some discrepancies in my financial records and personal belongings. I've also noticed that my daughter-in-law seems unusually interested in my assets and estate planning. Margaret has helped me understand that these could be warning signs of financial exploitation. Jessica shot to her feet with undisguised fury. This is ridiculous. Sue, you're obviously more confused than I thought if you're making these kinds of accusations. Doctor, this paranoid behavior is exactly what I was trying to tell you about. But her outburst had the opposite effect of what she intended. Instead of supporting her narrative about my mental decline, it revealed her true character and confirmed the concerns Margaret and I had raised about her motivations. Dr. Morrison stood as well, his professional demeanor now clearly protective. "Mrs. Marlowe, I think this consultation is over. Mrs. Phillips, I'm going to recommend that you contact Adult Protective Services to discuss your concerns about your living situation. I'm also going to document that you show no signs of cognitive impairment and are fully capable of making your own decisions about your care and finances." As we left the medical office, Jessica was silent with rage. Her carefully orchestrated plan to have me declared incompetent had not only failed, but had raised official suspicions about her own conduct. The drive home was tense, with Jessica gripping the steering wheel tightly while Margaret and I exchanged meaningful glances in the back seat. When we arrived at the house, Jessica immediately disappeared into her office, slamming the door behind her. Through the thin walls, we could hear her making agitated phone calls, though her words were too muffled to understand clearly. "She's panicking," Margaret observed quietly. "Her timeline has been completely disrupted, and now she has medical professionals questioning her credibility. She's going to have to make a decision about whether to abandon this operation or escalate to more desperate measures." I nodded, understanding that we'd reached the most dangerous phase of our confrontation. Jessica's careful, long-term strategy had been exposed and disrupted. If she was indeed responsible for the deaths Margaret had mentioned, she might decide that eliminating witnesses was preferable to abandoning her investment in this particular scheme. "The detective said they'd have people watching the house, starting this evening," Margaret reminded me. "But we need to be especially careful until then." As if summoned by our conversation, Jessica emerged from her office with an expression of forced calm that was more frightening than her earlier anger. She'd made some kind of decision during her phone calls, and I suspected it wasn't one that prioritized my continued health and safety. "Sue," she said with artificial sweetness, "I've been thinking about today's appointment, and I realize we may have been approaching your health concerns from the wrong angle. Perhaps what you need isn't medical evaluation but some time away from stressful situations to recover your equilibrium." The suggestion was delivered with the same caring tone she'd used for months, but now I recognized it as the voice of a predator preparing her final move. Margaret must have heard it too, because I felt her tense beside me. "What kind of time away?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Well, there's a lovely assisted living facility not far from here that specializes in temporary respite care. Just a few weeks in a calm, supportive environment might help you regain your confidence and clarity. I've already made some preliminary inquiries." There it was, Jessica's backup plan for removing me from the equation. If she couldn't have me declared incompetent through medical evaluation, she would convince David that I needed temporary care for my own safety. Once I was isolated in a facility where she could control access and information, she could proceed with her financial exploitation while I was unable to interfere. "That's very thoughtful of you," I replied carefully. "But I'm feeling much better now. I don't think residential care is necessary." Jessica's smile became strained. "Sue, I understand that no one wants to admit they need help, but sometimes family has to make difficult decisions for the safety of everyone involved. David and I have been discussing this, and we think some professional support might be exactly what you need." It was a lie, of course. David had no idea about any assisted living arrangements because Jessica was making these decisions unilaterally. But it was also a threat, delivered with the kind of gentle authority that would be difficult for David to question when he came home from work. "I think Sue should have a say in her own care decisions," Margaret interjected firmly. "She's been assessed by a medical professional today and found to be completely competent. Any decisions about residential care should be made by Sue herself, not by family members acting without her consent." Jessica's mask was beginning to slip again. "Margaret, I appreciate your concern, but you're not family. These decisions need to be made by people who have Sue's long-term interests at heart." And who would those people be? Margaret asked pointedly. Because it seems to me that Sue's interests might be better served by people who aren't trying to control her finances and living arrangements. The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Jessica realized that Margaret wasn't just an inconvenient witness, but an active opponent who understood exactly what was happening and was prepared to fight back. "I think you should leave," Jessica said, her voice cold and dangerous. "This is a family matter, and your interference is no longer welcome." Margaret stood her ground with the courage I remembered from her nursing days, when she'd faced down angry doctors and hostile family members to protect her patients. "I'm not going anywhere until I'm satisfied that Sue is safe. And right now, I have serious concerns about her safety in this house." It was the moment of open confrontation we'd been building toward. Jessica's careful facade was completely gone, replaced by the calculating predator who'd been hiding underneath the loving daughter-in-law performance. Margaret and I were no longer dealing with manipulation and gaslighting, but with direct threats and intimidation. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Jessica said, her voice carrying a menace that made my blood run cold. "Some situations are more complicated than they appear, and some people who interfere in family business find themselves facing unexpected consequences." Margaret didn't flinch. "Is that a threat, Mrs. Marlowe? Because if it is, I want to be very clear that I'm prepared to contact authorities about this conversation and any actions you might take against Sue or myself." Jessica's eyes flashed with fury, but she was also calculating the risks of her position. She'd revealed too much, threatened too openly, and now faced opponents who were prepared to involve law enforcement. Her carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing around her, and she was running out of options for salvaging the situation. "Get out of my house!" Jessica snarled, abandoning any pretense of civility. "Both of you, pack your things, Sue, because you won't be staying here much longer regardless." It was exactly the kind of statement the detective had hoped we could provoke her into making on record. Margaret's recording device had captured not just Jessica's threats, but also her implicit admission that she had the power to remove me from my own son's house against my will. But it was also a declaration of war. Jessica had moved beyond manipulation and deception to open hostility and intimidation. The woman who'd spent months carefully positioning herself as my caring advocate had finally revealed herself as my enemy, and she was prepared to use whatever means necessary to achieve her goals. As Margaret and I retreated to my room to wait for the law enforcement support that was supposed to arrive that evening, I reflected on how completely the situation had transformed. Just days earlier, I'd been an isolated, confused victim questioning my own sanity and fearing for my future. Now I was part of a coordinated operation to expose and stop a serial predator who'd built her life around destroying elderly people. But I also understood that the most dangerous part of our confrontation was still ahead. Jessica had been cornered and exposed, but she hadn't been defeated. A desperate predator with a history of violence and a significant financial incentive to eliminate threats was capable of anything. The next few hours would determine whether justice prevailed or whether Jessica's final gambit would succeed in silencing the witnesses who could destroy her carefully constructed new life. The stakes couldn't be higher, and failure wasn't an option, not just for me, but for all the future victims who would suffer if Jessica escaped to start her deadly cycle all over again. Outside my bedroom window, the afternoon shadows were growing longer, marking time until the moment when all our careful planning would be put to the ultimate test. The hours that followed Jessica's open threats felt like being trapped in the eye of a hurricane, waiting for the storm to break with full force. Margaret and I remained in my room, ostensibly packing my belongings as Jessica had demanded, but actually preparing for what we both knew would be a final, desperate confrontation. Through the thin walls, we could hear Jessica's voice rising and falling as she made increasingly frantic phone calls, her carefully controlled facade completely abandoned. "She's calling someone about accelerating whatever endgame she has planned," Margaret whispered, pressing her ear to the wall that separated my room from Jessica's office. I can't make out the details, but she keeps mentioning tonight and something about making it look natural. The words sent ice through my veins. If Jessica was indeed responsible for the deaths the detective had mentioned, she might be planning to eliminate the witnesses who could expose her crimes. The thought of Margaret becoming another casualty in Jessica's predatory campaign filled me with a protective fury I hadn't felt since David was young and faced playground bullies. "We need to get you out of here," I told Margaret firmly. "This was never supposed to put you in physical danger." Margaret's expression hardened with the stubborn determination I remembered from her nursing days. "I'm not abandoning you now, Sue. We've come too far and learned too much to let her win through intimidation." Before I could argue further, we heard the front door slam with enough force to rattle the windows. Jessica had left the house, but whether she was fleeing or gathering resources for her next move was impossible to determine. Margaret immediately called the detective who'd been coordinating with us, but the call went straight to voicemail. "The backup surveillance team should be in position by now," Margaret said, checking her phone for messages. "But I'm not seeing any activity outside." I moved to the window and peered through the curtains at the street below. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always did on a Monday afternoon. Quiet, peaceful, with no sign of the law enforcement presence we'd been promised. A terrible thought began forming in my mind. Margaret, what if Jessica has connections we don't know about? What if she's been able to delay or redirect the police response? The possibility was frightening, but not implausible. Jessica had demonstrated sophisticated knowledge of legal and medical systems, suggesting experience with manipulating official processes. If she'd spent years perfecting her predatory techniques, she might have developed methods for avoiding law enforcement scrutiny. Margaret was already dialing another number, this time reaching a different detective in the jurisdiction where Jennifer Marlowe had been previously arrested. "Detective Williams, this is Margaret Chen. We spoke yesterday about the Jessica Marlowe case. I think we may have a problem." The conversation that followed confirmed our worst fears. Detective Williams explained that there had been some kind of communication breakdown between agencies, and the local surveillance team had been redirected to what they'd been told was a higher priority case. Someone with authority and credibility had convinced law enforcement that our situation was less urgent than originally assessed. "But that's impossible," Margaret protested. "We have recorded evidence of threats and documented proof of her criminal background." "I believe you completely," Detective Williams assured her. "But someone with official credentials contacted our local counterparts and suggested that the situation involved a family dispute being exaggerated by well-meaning but misguided individuals. The language used suggested that you and Mrs. Phillips might be experiencing some confusion about the severity of the situation." The implications were staggering. Jessica had somehow managed to manipulate law enforcement communications, using her knowledge of how agencies coordinated to create doubt about our credibility. She'd turned our own reports against us, making us appear to be confused elderly women making unfounded accusations. "What do we do now?" I asked Margaret after she ended the call. "We stick to the plan, but we assume we're on our own until Detective Williams can straighten out the communication problems," Margaret replied with grim determination. "We have the evidence, we have the recordings, and we have each other. Jessica may have bought herself some time, but she hasn't actually solved her problem." The afternoon stretched endlessly as we waited for Jessica's return or David's arrival, from work, whichever came first. Margaret continued monitoring Jessica's abandoned office, searching for additional evidence while I reviewed the documentation we'd already gathered. The picture that emerged was of a predator far more sophisticated and dangerous than we'd initially realized. Hidden in Jessica's files were detailed dossiers on multiple elderly individuals, complete with financial information, health records, and family dynamics. Some of the names matched missing person reports Margaret found through online searches, while others corresponded to obituaries for people who'd died under circumstances that now seemed suspicious. "Look at this," Margaret said, holding up a notebook filled with Jessica's handwriting. "It's like a how-to manual for targeting elderly victims. She's documented which medications can cause confusion, which living arrangements create isolation, and which financial instruments are easiest to manipulate." The notebook read like a predator's playbook, refined through years of practice. Jessica had studied elder abuse the way a scientist studies a laboratory experiment, perfecting her techniques through trial and error on human subjects. The cold, methodical approach to destroying lives was more chilling than any emotional outburst could have been. But the most disturbing discovery was a timeline showing her progression from financial exploitation to what appeared to be murder. Early entries focused on theft and fraud, but later victims had died under increasingly suspicious circumstances. The progression suggested that Jessica had crossed the line from predator to killer when financial gain alone wasn't sufficient to satisfy her needs. "She's not just stealing money anymore," Margaret observed, studying the timeline. "She's developed a taste for the power that comes from completely controlling someone's life and death." The front door opened just as we were photographing the final pages of Jessica's notebook. We quickly returned everything to its original position and retreated to my room, hearts pounding with the knowledge that we'd just documented evidence of multiple murders. But the footsteps approaching down the hallway were too heavy to be Jessica's, and the familiar rhythm told me that David had come home early from work. "Mom, are you here?" David's voice carried concern and confusion. Jessica called and said there was some kind of emergency. Margaret and I exchanged glances, realizing that Jessica had summoned David home as part of whatever plan she was executing. This could be our opportunity to warn him about his wife's true nature, but it could also be a trap designed to isolate us further. "We're in here, dear," I called, opening my bedroom door to find David standing in the hallway with the worried expression he'd worn as a child when he sensed that something was wrong but couldn't identify the threat. "What's going on, Mom?" "Jessica said you and Margaret had some kind of confrontation, and she was concerned about your mental state. She mentioned something about paranoid delusions and accusations." The words hit like physical blows. Jessica had gotten to David first, priming him to dismiss whatever we told him as the confused ramblings of elderly women experiencing psychological breakdown. She was using his love for me as a weapon against both of us, just as she'd been doing for months. "David, sit down," I said gently, leading him to the chair beside my bed. "What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I need you to listen with an open mind." Over the next 30 minutes, Margaret and I presented David with everything we'd discovered about his wife. We showed him the documentation of her lies, the evidence of her previous crimes, and the proof of her systematic campaign to have me declared incompetent. We played the recordings of her threats and shared the photographs of her predatory planning materials. David's reaction was everything I'd feared and expected. Denial, anger, confusion, and desperate attempts to find alternative explanations for the evidence we presented. His love for Jessica made it nearly impossible for him to accept that she was capable of such calculated cruelty. "There has to be some mistake," he kept saying. "Jessica loves our family. She's been nothing but caring and supportive since she came into our lives." "That's exactly how predators like her operate," Margaret explained with professional patience. "They identify targets through their vulnerabilities and build relationships specifically designed to exploit those weaknesses. Everything about her courtship and marriage was calculated to gain access to your family's resources." But David couldn't process the magnitude of the betrayal. His wife, the woman he'd trusted with his heart and his child, was actually a serial killer who'd married him to gain access to his mother's assets. The cognitive dissonance was too overwhelming to accept without absolute proof. "Where is Jessica now?" David asked finally. "If these accusations are true, shouldn't we confront her directly?" "She left hours ago," I explained. "We don't know where she went or when she's coming back. but we're concerned that she might be planning something desperate now that her cover has been blown." David stood abruptly, pacing to the window with the same restless energy he'd displayed as a teenager, when faced with problems he couldn't solve. "This is insane. You're talking about my wife like she's some kind of criminal mastermind. Jessica works in marketing, for God's sake. She helps plan charity fundraisers and coaches Tommy's soccer team, all of which provided perfect cover for studying potential victims and establishing community credibility," Margaret pointed out. "David, I know this is hard to accept, but your wife is extremely dangerous. The evidence suggests she's killed multiple people, and Sue and I are now threats to her operation." Before David could respond, we heard a car in the driveway. Jessica had returned, and from the sound of multiple doors closing, she hadn't come alone. Margaret moved to the window and peered through the curtains, her face paling at whatever she saw. "There are 3 men with her," Margaret whispered urgently. "They look like they mean business, and one of them is carrying what looks like medical equipment." The implications were terrifying. Jessica had recruited accomplices for whatever she was planning, and the medical equipment suggested she intended to make my elimination look like a natural death or medical emergency. The scenario was becoming clear. Jessica would claim that the stress of being confronted with false accusations had triggered a heart attack or stroke, supported by whatever substances were in that medical kit. "David, you need to call the police right now," I said urgently. "Whatever you believe about Jessica, you can see that this situation has escalated beyond anything that can be resolved through family discussion." But David was still struggling with cognitive dissonance, unable to reconcile the wife he loved with the predator we'd described. Maybe they're EMTs. Maybe Jessica called for medical assistance because she was worried about your health. Margaret grabbed David's shoulders with the firm authority she'd used with confused family members in hospital settings. "David, listen to me very carefully. Your wife is not who you think she is. Those men are not here to help anyone. If you don't call for police backup right now, you're going to lose your mother and possibly your own life." The front door opened with the sound of multiple people entering the house. Jessica's voice carried down the hallway, but she was speaking to her companions rather than calling out to announce her return. The conversation was too quiet to understand, but the tone was businesslike and urgent. "Mom, pack a bag quickly," David said, finally accepting the severity of the situation. "We're leaving right now, and I'll sort out the truth later." But as we moved toward the bedroom door, we heard footsteps approaching rapidly down the hallway. Jessica appeared in the doorway before we could leave, flanked by 2 men in dark clothing who looked more like security contractors than medical personnel. Her transformation was complete. Gone was any pretense of the loving daughter-in-law, replaced by a cold, calculating predator who'd been backed into a corner. "Hello, David," Jessica said with artificial warmth. "I'm so glad you're here. Your mother has been having a very difficult day, and I think we need to take some immediate action for everyone's safety." David stared at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. The Jessica standing in the doorway bore little resemblance to the woman he'd married. Her posture was different, her expression was different, and most importantly, her eyes held a coldness that he'd never seen before. "Jessica, what's going on? Who are these men?" "They're specialists in geriatric crisis intervention," Jessica replied smoothly. "Your mother has been exhibiting signs of severe paranoid delusions, making wild accusations, and threatening self-harm. Sometimes elderly people experiencing cognitive breakdown require immediate professional intervention." It was a masterful lie, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd practiced similar deceptions before. But the presence of armed men in our home contradicted the caring medical narrative Jessica was trying to establish. "I don't see any medical credentials," Margaret observed, her nursing background making her immediately suspicious of the supposed medical professionals. "And I don't see any emergency authorization paperwork that would justify involuntary medical intervention." One of Jessica's companions stepped forward with a badge that looked official, but could have been purchased online. "Ma'am, We're responding to reports of an elderly person in crisis who may pose a danger to herself and others. We have authority to conduct emergency psychiatric evaluation and transport. Margaret wasn't intimidated. Then you'll need to provide proper documentation and explain why you're not following standard protocols for psychiatric emergency response. Where's the police backup that's required for involuntary commitment proceedings? The questions were, revealing the flaws in Jessica's hastily improvised plan. Whatever credentials her companions possessed, they weren't sufficient to justify the forcible removal of a competent adult from her home. Jessica had overplayed her hand, revealing herself too early and with insufficient legal cover. "David," Jessica said, turning to her husband with calculated desperation, "you can see that your mother's condition has deteriorated rapidly. She's making paranoid accusations, claiming I'm trying to harm her, even suggesting that I'm some kind of criminal. This is exactly the kind of break from reality that requires immediate intervention." But David was no longer the trusting husband who would accept his wife's word without question. The evidence Margaret and I had shown him, combined with Jessica's current behavior, had created enough doubt to make him question everything. "Jessica, I need you to explain what's really happening here. These accusations about your background, the evidence Mom and Margaret showed me, if it's all false, then prove it. Show me documentation that contradicts what they've discovered." Jessica's mask slipped further, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "David, I'm disappointed that you would choose to believe wild conspiracy theories over your own wife, but I suppose genetic predisposition to mental illness might explain why you're being influenced by your mother's delusions." The insult was designed to manipulate David through shame and self-doubt, but it had the opposite effect. Instead of making him question his own judgment, it revealed Jessica's willingness to attack anyone who threatened her control over the situation. "That's enough," David said, his voice carrying a strength I hadn't heard since he was young and protecting smaller children from bullies. "I don't know what's really going on here, but I know that my mother is not delusional, and these men have no business in our house without proper legal authority." Jessica's expression hardened with cold fury. "Fine. Since you're choosing to be difficult, we'll do this the hard way." She nodded to her companions, who immediately moved to block the doorway, while the third man opened what we now realized was not medical equipment, but rather a collection of syringes and restraints. The pretense was completely abandoned. This was kidnapping and possibly murder, carried out with clinical efficiency. But Jessica had made one critical miscalculation. In her focus on neutralizing Margaret and me, she'd underestimated David's capacity for protective action when his family was threatened. My son might have been naive about his wife's true nature, but he wasn't weak or helpless when confronted with clear and immediate danger. David's response was swift and decisive. Instead of attempting to negotiate or reason with armed intruders, he immediately activated the panic alarm system he'd installed throughout the house after Robert's death. The piercing sound would alert the security company and automatically summon police response, regardless of any communication problems that had delayed earlier intervention. Jessica's carefully orchestrated plan was falling apart rapidly. The alarm system would bring unwanted attention, and her companions weren't prepared for the kind of extended confrontation that would result from police involvement. They'd expected to complete their operation quickly and quietly, not to engage in a standoff with law enforcement. "Shut that off!" Jessica shouted at David, but he'd deliberately triggered the system from a panel that required his personal code to deactivate. "Not until you and your friends leave our house," David replied, positioning himself between the intruders and Margaret and me. The sound of approaching sirens confirmed that police were responding to the alarm activation. Jessica's face contorted, with rage as she realized that months of careful planning were being destroyed by her own impatience and overconfidence. "You have no idea what you've done," she snarled at David. "This family was supposed to provide for my future, and now you've ruined everything." It was exactly the kind of admission law enforcement would need to understand the true nature of Jessica's crimes. But it was also a declaration that she had nothing left to lose, making her exponentially more dangerous in these final moments before police arrival. One of her companions was already moving toward the window, clearly intending to escape before being trapped by law enforcement. But Jessica seemed frozen with fury, unable to accept that her carefully constructed new life was collapsing around her. "Jessica, it's over," Margaret said with the calm authority she'd used to de-escalate crisis situations during her nursing career. "The police are coming, your cover is blown, and continuing to resist will only make things worse for you." But Jessica was beyond rational calculation. The predator who'd spent years perfecting her techniques for destroying elderly victims couldn't accept defeat at the hands of the very people she'd intended to eliminate. "It's not over until I say it's over," Jessica replied, reaching into her purse for what Margaret and I both recognized as a weapon. The next few seconds would determine whether Jessica's reign of terror would end with her capture, or with additional victims. Everything we'd worked for, all the evidence we'd gathered, and all the lives that could be saved by stopping her predatory career, hung in the balance of these final moments before justice arrived. The sirens were getting closer, but they might not arrive in time to prevent Jessica from making one last desperate attempt to eliminate the witnesses who could destroy her forever. The woman who'd entered our lives as the perfect daughter-in-law was about to reveal the full extent of her capacity for violence, and we were about to discover whether our careful planning and David's protective instincts would be enough to survive her final gambit. The weapon in Jessica's hand transformed the entire dynamic of our confrontation. What had been a battle of wits and evidence suddenly became a life-or-death struggle with a cornered predator who had nothing left to lose. The sirens were growing, louder, but they still seemed impossibly distant as Jessica raised the gun with the steady hand of someone who'd used violence before. "Nobody moves," Jessica commanded, her voice carrying a coldness that chilled me to the bone. "David, shut off that alarm system now, or your mother dies first." David's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. "Jessica, put the gun down. The police are already on their way. Hurting anyone now will only make things worse for you." "Worse for me?" Jessica laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. "David, you still don't understand what you're dealing with. I've spent 3 years building this life, investing in this family, positioning myself for the biggest payoff of my career. I'm not walking away empty-handed because of some senile old woman and her nosy friend." Margaret stepped slightly forward, using her nursing experience to project calm authority even in the face of mortal danger. "Jessica, you're making this situation much more serious than it needs to be. Right now, you're facing fraud and elder abuse charges. But if you hurt someone with that weapon, you're looking at murder charges that will put you away for life." "Murder charges?" Jessica's smile was predatory and terrifying. "Margaret, you really have no idea who you're dealing with. I've been perfecting the art of making deaths look accidental for years. The elderly are so fragile, so prone to heart attacks and strokes when they're under stress. Sometimes they even fall downstairs when they're confused and disoriented." The casual way she described murdering her previous victims revealed the true depth of her psychopathy. This wasn't a desperate woman making threats in a moment of panic. This was a serial killer discussing her craft with professional pride. "You killed them," I said, the words emerging as both accusation and realization. "All those elderly people whose files we found in your office, you didn't just steal from them, you murdered them." Jessica's eyes glittered with something that might have been satisfaction. "They served their purpose, Sue. Just like you were supposed to serve yours. A lonely widow with substantial assets and a caring daughter-in-law who was devoted to her welfare. It would have been a beautiful story of family love and tragic loss." David made a sound like he'd been physically struck. "Jessica, how can... You talk about my mother like she's... Like she's just an asset to be exploited? Because that's exactly what she is, David. What you all are. Do you think I married you for love? Do you think any of this was real? Jessica's laugh was cruel and mocking. You were a means to an end. A lonely widower with an elderly mother and comfortable family wealth. The perfect target for someone with my particular skills. The revelation was devastating David in ways that went beyond the immediate physical danger. His entire marriage, everything he'd believed about his wife's love and devotion, was crumbling before his eyes. But I could see him struggling to process the emotional destruction while maintaining focus on the immediate threat to our lives. One of Jessica's accomplices was growing visibly nervous as the sirens continued to approach. "We need to go," he said urgently. "This operation is blown, and staying here any longer is suicide." "We're not leaving empty-handed," Jessica replied coldly. "I've invested too much in this family to walk away with nothing." "What are you talking about?" the man demanded. "The police will be here any minute. Whatever you're planning, there's no time to execute it." Jessica's smile was chilling in its calculation. "There's always time for one final transaction. David, you're going to transfer everything from your mother's accounts to the overseas accounts I've already established. Right now, while we still have access to her financial information." The demand revealed the true scope of Jessica's desperation. Unable to complete her long-term plan to gain legal control over my assets, she was attempting to steal everything through immediate electronic transfer. It was a crude and risky approach that would leave obvious evidence of theft, but it might allow her to escape with substantial funds before authorities could freeze the accounts. "I don't have access to Mom's accounts," David protested. "She handles her own finances." "Don't lie to me, David. I've seen the paperwork. You have emergency access to all her accounts through the family trust your father established. The same trust that would have made you her financial guardian when I had her declared incompetent." Jessica had been studying our family's financial arrangements far more thoroughly than any of us had realized. Her knowledge of Robert's estate planning and the emergency provisions he'd established revealed months of careful research and preparation. "Even if I could access those accounts, I wouldn't steal from my own mother," David said firmly. "Whatever you think you know about our family, you're wrong if you believe I'd betray the people I love for money." Jessica's expression hardened, with frustration and growing panic. The sirens were now clearly approaching our street, and her window for escape was rapidly closing. Her accomplices were already moving toward the window, preparing to flee whether she came with them or not. "Then you've chosen to make this much more difficult than necessary," Jessica said, turning the gun toward me with deadly intent. But Margaret had been carefully positioning herself during the conversation, using her knowledge of crisis de-escalation to create an opportunity for intervention. As Jessica shifted her attention and aimed toward me, Margaret launched herself forward, with the fierce protectiveness that had made her such an effective advocate for vulnerable patients. The collision sent Jessica stumbling backward, her shot going wild and shattering the window behind us. Margaret and Jessica crashed into the dresser, fighting desperately for control of the weapon while David lunged forward to help subdue his wife. Jessica's accomplices abandoned any pretense of supporting her operation, diving through the broken window to escape before police could surround the house. Their departure left Jessica isolated and outnumbered, but she fought with the desperate strength of someone who understood that capture meant life imprisonment for multiple murders. The struggle was brief but violent. Jessica managed to break free from Margaret's grip and swing the gun toward David, but her desperation made her movements wild and uncontrolled. David grabbed her wrist, forcing the weapon toward the ceiling, as another shot discharged harmlessly into the plaster. I watched in terror as my son wrestled with the woman he'd loved and trusted, both of them fighting for control of a weapon that would determine who lived and who died. Jessica's transformation was complete. The caring daughter-in-law had been replaced by a snarling predator willing to kill anyone who threatened her survival. The sound of police vehicles screeching to a halt outside the house provided the distraction. Jessica needed to break free from David's grip. But instead of trying to escape, she raised the gun one final time with clear intent to eliminate the primary witness to her crimes. The calculation in her eyes told me everything I needed to know about her decision. "If I can't have the money, at least I can silence the evidence," Jessica said, her finger tightening on the trigger. But the bedroom door burst open at that exact moment, revealing armed police officers who'd responded to the alarm with tactical precision. "Drop the weapon. Drop it now." Jessica hesitated for a crucial second, weighing her options between surrender and murder-suicide. In that moment of indecision, David tackled her with the protective fury of a son defending his mother, sending them both crashing to the floor as the gun skittered across the room. The police officers moved with professional efficiency, securing the weapon and restraining Jessica while she screamed threats and accusations at everyone present. Her facade was completely gone, replaced by the unhinged rage of a predator who'd been denied her kill. "You think you've won?" Jessica snarled as the officers placed her in handcuffs. "I've been doing this for years, and I'll be doing it again long after you're all dead. Old people die every day, and no one questions it when they're devoted family. Members inherit everything." Her words were being recorded by multiple devices, providing law enforcement with the confession they'd need to connect her to unsolved deaths across multiple states. But they also revealed the depth of her psychopathy and her complete lack of remorse for the lives she'd destroyed. Detective Williams arrived within minutes of Jessica's arrest, having driven from the neighboring state when communication problems had prevented the local response we'd originally expected. His presence provided the coordination necessary to ensure that Jessica's crimes were properly documented and prosecuted across all relevant jurisdictions. "Mrs. Phillips, are you injured?" Detective Williams asked with genuine concern. "Physically, I'm fine," I replied, though my hands were shaking from the adrenaline of our near-death experience. "But emotionally, I think it will take some time to process what we've been through." Margaret was being examined by paramedics who'd arrived with the police response, but she waved off their concerns with typical nursing stubbornness. "I've dealt with worse in the ER," she insisted, though I could see the strain of our ordeal in her eyes. David sat quietly in the corner, staring at the handcuffs on his wife's wrists, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The emotional devastation of discovering Jessica's true nature was hitting him harder than the physical danger we'd all faced. "Son," I said gently, sitting beside him and taking his hand, "none of this was your fault. Jessica is a professional predator who spent years perfecting her ability to deceive people. You couldn't have known what she really was." "But I should have listened to you sooner," David replied, his voice heavy with guilt and regret. "You tried to tell me something was wrong, and I dismissed your concerns as confusion or paranoia. I almost got you killed because I was too blind to see what was happening in my own house." "You listened when it mattered most," Margaret interjected from across the room. "When the evidence was clear and your family was in danger, you did exactly what needed to be done. That alarm system you activated probably saved all our lives." Detective Williams approached with a tablet containing digital forms and official documentation. "Mrs. Phillips, I need to go through Jessica's files and activities with you to build a comprehensive case against her. Based on what we've found so far, she's connected to at least 7 suspicious deaths across 4 states. Your testimony and the evidence you gathered will be crucial to getting justice for all her victims." Over the following hours, we provided detailed statements about Jessica's systematic campaign of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and attempted murder. The evidence Margaret and I had collected, combined with Jessica's recorded confessions and the physical proof found in her possession, painted a picture of a serial killer who'd perfected the art of targeting vulnerable elderly people. The investigation revealed that Jessica had been operating under multiple identities for over a decade, marrying into families with elderly relatives and systematically destroying them for financial gain. The sophisticated nature of her operations suggested extensive planning and possibly criminal connections that facilitated her ability to establish false identities and manipulate official records. "She's going to prison for the rest of her life," Detective Williams assured us. "Between the murder charges, fraud, elder abuse, and attempted homicide, she'll never have another opportunity to hurt innocent people." But the victory felt hollow, in light of what our family had lost. David's marriage was destroyed. Tommy would have to process the trauma of learning that his stepmother was a murderer, and all of us would carry the psychological scars of having been targeted by such calculated evil. The house that had been my refuge became a crime scene requiring extensive processing by forensics teams. The room where I'd felt safe and welcome was now marked by bullet holes and bloodstains that would forever remind us of how close we'd come to becoming Jessica's final victims. In the days that followed Jessica's arrest, the true scope of her crimes became apparent through media coverage and law enforcement briefings. She'd stolen millions of dollars from elderly victims across multiple states, and the suspicious deaths connected to her operations numbered far more than initially suspected. Families who'd lost elderly relatives under circumstances they'd always questioned finally had answers, though the knowledge that their loved ones had been murdered brought its own form of grief and trauma. Jessica's arrest provided justice, but it couldn't restore the lives she'd destroyed or repair the families she'd shattered. For our family, healing would be a long and difficult process. David struggled with guilt and betrayal, questioning his judgment and ability to trust his own perceptions. Tommy required counseling to understand why someone he'd trusted had tried to hurt his grandmother. And I faced the challenge of rebuilding my sense of safety and security after months of systematic psychological manipulation. But we also discovered strengths we hadn't known we possessed. David's protective instincts had emerged when his family faced mortal danger. Margaret's friendship had provided the support and expertise necessary to expose Jessica's crimes. And my own resilience had enabled me to transform from victim to survivor to advocate for justice. The experience taught me that age doesn't make someone helpless or vulnerable. It provides experience, wisdom, and perspective that can be powerful weapons against those who would exploit others. Jessica had assumed that elderly people were easy targets who could be manipulated and discarded without consequence. She learned too late that underestimating your opponents is a fatal mistake. 6 months later, I testified at Jessica's trial, looking directly into the eyes of the woman who'd tried to destroy my family as I described her systematic campaign of abuse and attempted murder. She showed no remorse, no recognition of the pain she'd caused, no acknowledgement that her victims had been human beings with families who loved them. The judge sentenced Jessica to life in prison without possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never again have the opportunity to target vulnerable people. But more importantly, her conviction sent a message to other predators that elder abuse would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Margaret and I became advocates for elder abuse prevention, sharing our story with community groups and law enforcement agencies to help others recognize the warning signs of predatory behavior. Our experience had shown us that education and awareness were the best defenses against people like Jessica. David eventually found the strength to rebuild his life, though he approached new relationships with understandable caution. Tommy grew into a young man who understood the importance of protecting vulnerable people, carrying forward the lessons he'd learned from our ordeal. As for me, I chose to remain in my own home, rather than moving back in with David. The experience had reinforced my independence and my capability to manage my own affairs. I wasn't a helpless elderly woman who needed others to make decisions for me. I was a survivor who'd faced down a serial killer and lived to tell the story. The roses in my garden bloom more beautifully now, tended with the same care and attention I've learned to apply to my own life. I water them each morning while reflecting on how close I came to losing everything, and how the strength I found in my darkest moments became the foundation for a stronger, more purposeful future. Jessica thought she could break me by breaking my arm, but she actually broke her own future through her impatience and arrogance. She underestimated a woman who'd lived 7 decades learning how to survive, and that mistake cost her everything she'd worked to build. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes justice prevails over evil. In our case, both proved true, and the woman who tried to erase me from existence learned that some people refuse to be erased. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.